The dining room smelled faintly of vanilla frosting and fried chicken, a strange mix of celebration and fatigue. My mother had set the table with her favorite china, the one she only used when she wanted everything to look perfect. The candles flickered beside a cake that said Happy 20th Clara in careful blue letters. Outside, the Illinois twilight pressed against the windows soft and pink like the inside of a seashell. Rick, my stepfather, sat at the head of the table the same way he always did, like a general at his post. He had already poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey before we even sat down. His voice carried easily over the clinking of silverware. He was telling another story from his army days about discipline, about how he once made a man scrub the floor with a toothbrush for talking back. Everyone laughed except me. I smiled politely, tracing the rim of my glass with my finger. My brother Evan leaned in laughing too loudly, trying to match Rick's energy. Mom kept refilling plates, avoiding eye contact with either of them. Her hands moved fast, but her smile looked heavy. Rick turned toward me. "So, architecture school, huh?" He dragged the word like a challenge. "Still drawing pretty pictures and calling it work." I swallowed. "It is a degree program, not crayons and paper." He chuckled. "Sure, sure. Maybe someday you can design dollhouses for people who can't afford the real thing." Evan snorted into his drink. Mom said softly, "Rick," but her voice disappeared under his laugh. I pushed a piece of chicken around my plate. The candlelight made the silver edge of the knife tremble slightly. He leaned closer, lowering his tone. "You know your problem is you think you are better than everyone else." I looked at him then, meeting his eyes for the first time that evening. "I do not think I am better. I just do not think hurting people makes you strong." The table went still. His jaw clenched. For a second, the only sound was the slow tick of the kitchen clock. Mom reached across. "Clara, honey, let us not do this tonight. It is your birthday," Evan muttered. "Yeah, do not ruin it." Rick exhaled through his nose, that short sound he made right before losing control. He stood chair, scraping the floor. "You know what your father never taught you. Respect." My stomach tightened. My real father had been dead 12 years. I had learned to stop correcting him when he used that word. He stepped back, pacing behind his chair. The candlelight flickered against his face, half shadow, half anger. "Say something," he said. "Go ahead. Show everyone how much smarter you are." I stayed quiet. Silence was my last defense. He mistook it for defiance. In the reflection of the window beside me, I saw it happen before I felt it. The chair left his hands and spun across the glass like a dark bird. There was a sharp crack, then white pain. I hit the floor before my brain caught up. The sound of the plate breaking followed, and then the smell of frosting and smoke. Mom screamed my name. Evan shouted something I could not hear. When I opened my eyes, the world tilted sideways. The edge of the table blurred candles rolling. Blood dripped warm into my ear. I saw my mother frozen beside the counter, one hand on her mouth. Evan's face, pale, unsure. Rick stood breathing hard, the empty space where the chair had been behind him. No one moved. I tried to sit up, but the room spun. The air hummed with electricity and fear. The cake was still burning, the candles melting into a pool of wax. The smell of sugar turned bitter. Someone called 911. I heard my mother's trembling voice on the phone, the words, "accident" and "please, come quickly," repeated again and again. Rick disappeared down the hall. The sound of running water came from the bathroom sink. I lay there, eyes half open, watching the flicker of red and blue lights fill the room. When the paramedics burst in, their voices cut through the silence. "Where's the injury head trauma?" "We need a collar." Mom pointed, her hands shaking. She kept saying it was just an accident, just an accident. They lifted me onto the stretcher. My hair stuck to the blood on my neck. As they wheeled me past the table, I turned my head slightly toward them, toward all of them still standing there like statues. "You all saw it," I whispered. No one answered. Outside, the siren started low and rising. Through the window, I could still see the glow of the birthday cake, one candle stubbornly upright burning against the dark. That was the last thing I remembered from my 20th birthday. The first thing I saw was light. Harsh, white, humming light that made my head ache. My throat was dry and my tongue felt like paper. Something beeped in rhythm with my pulse. It took a few seconds to realize I was in a hospital bed. The blanket was thin, the sheets too clean. My left arm ached where the IV entered, taped tight. I tried to move, but my neck screamed in protest. A nurse leaned over me. "Good morning, sweetheart. Do not move too fast. You had quite a hit." Her voice was kind but distant, the way people sound when they have said the same sentence too many times. I asked for water. My voice came out as a croak. She handed me a small cup with a straw. "Sip slowly. Your mom's outside waiting." I nodded. The word mom filled me with confusion and dread at the same time. The nurse left and the silence settled heavy again. The curtain shifted and then my mother appeared holding a vase of pale daisies. Her face looked older, her eyes swollen. She set the flowers down and tried to smile. "You scared us, Clara." Her voice trembled on the word scared. I watched her hands. They were shaking. I wanted to ask where Rick was, but I already knew. He was probably home pretending nothing happened, maybe washing the whiskey glass he left on the counter. My mother reached for my hand, but I didn't take it. She said softly, "You know how your stepfather gets when he drinks. It was just one of those nights." I stared at the ceiling. "And when he's sober?" I asked quietly. She flinched, eyes dropping. Before she could answer, the curtain opened again. A uniformed officer stepped inside, a notepad in his hand. He looked young, calm, too calm. "Ms. Jensen, I just need a few minutes of your time." My mom straightened up. "Officer, she's still weak. Maybe later." He looked at me instead. "Ma'am, I just need to know if you want to file a report." I looked at him, my lips parted, but no words came. My mother's voice cut in fast. "It was an accident. She tripped." The officer's eyes flicked between us. He nodded slowly, as if he had heard this before. "I'll make a note," he said quietly. "The report will stay open if you change your mind." He left without another word. My mother let out a shaky breath. "You see, it's over now. Let's just move on." The words "moved on" made something twist inside me. She meant forget, erase, smooth it over until no one remembers the bruise. I turned away from her. After a moment, I heard her whisper, "I'm sorry." Then the sound of her shoes leaving the room. I was alone again. I stared at the wall. It was too white, too empty. The machine beside me clicked every few seconds, a small electronic heartbeat that filled the space where silence should have been. My mind drifted backward to my father. Not Rick. My real father. I remembered his hands rough from work, smelling of pine and dust. I remembered the way he let me hold his hammer when I was little, how he told me, "Every good thing starts with a plan. Build it first in your mind, then make it real." That sentence came back like a whisper, faint but solid. I reached for the bed remote and raised the head slightly. The movement made my skull pound, but it grounded me. Outside, the door, voices murmured. A social worker entered, clipboard in hand, glasses low on her nose. "Hi, Clara. I'm Denise. I'm with Patient Services. I just wanted to check in." She glanced around, lowered her tone. "The nurse mentioned there might have been a domestic incident." I didn't reply. She placed a pamphlet on the bedside table. "There are resources if you need them. It's confidential." Her smile was soft, practiced. I nodded because that's what people expect. After she left, I picked up the brochure. The title read, "When Home Isn't Safe." I folded it twice and slid it under my pillow. I didn't want to look at it, but I couldn't throw it away either. The hours blurred. Afternoon light moved slowly across the tile floor. Nurses came and went. Dinner came on a plastic tray, untouched. When night fell, the room darkened except for the monitor's glow. I touched the side of my head, feeling the bandage. Beneath it, a small pulse of pain. It reminded me I was still here. My phone was on the side table screen, cracked. No missed calls. No texts from Evan. No message from Mom after she left. I turned it face down. The silence filled every corner. For the first time in my life, silence felt alive. It pressed against my ears like weight. It whispered, "You saw it. They saw it." No one spoke. I closed my eyes and saw again the reflection in the window, the chair mid-air, the moment before pain. It replayed like a loop. The angle of the light, the shape of his arm, the sound of the candle tipping over. I could still smell sugar burning. My throat tightened. I wanted to cry, but no tears came. The machine beeped once, twice steady. I breathed with it counting. Breathe in, breathe out, survive. A nurse checked on me before dawn. She said I could probably go home in 2 days. Home. The word felt wrong. I whispered, I don't have one. She didn't hear me. She smiled and wrote something on the chart. When she left, I stared at my hand resting on the blanket. The veins showed pale blue beneath the skin, the hand of someone still alive. I turned it palm up, curling my fingers slowly. They were trembling, but they were mine. The memory of the hammer returned again, heavy and sure. I whispered to the dark, I'll build something new. The monitor kept its slow rhythm beside me, the sound of a quiet promise. I was 8 years old when I learned what being replaced felt like. The memory comes back in fragments, sharp and cold like pieces of glass. The church smelled of rain and lilies. People spoke softly, their voices echoing off wooden pews. My father's coffin rested near the altar, the same dark wood he used for the porch swing we built together the summer before. I remember clinging to the hem of my mother's black dress, the fabric damp where my tears soaked through. Everyone said he was gone to a better place, but all I could think was that he still had my favorite screwdriver in his back pocket. When the service ended, I heard my mother whisper to someone behind me, "Rick will take care of us now." The words landed like a door closing. I didn't know who Rick was, but even then, I understood that we no longer belonged to my father's world. Rick moved in before the leaves turned brown. He came with crisp uniforms and the smell of engine oil, his voice always a little too loud for the small rooms of our house. He called me kiddo at first, rough and distant, as if testing the word on his tongue. My mother laughed more those days, but it was the laughter that sounds like something cracking underneath. Rick was always cleaning, always ordering, always talking about structure and rules. He said the Army taught him that families fall apart because people forget who's in charge. Mom nodded at everything he said. Evan was born a year later, and suddenly Rick had someone to mold. He carried my baby brother around like a trophy, calling him my little soldier. When Evan turned 3, he got a toy truck and I got a book about manners. Rick said you could learn something from your brother. He listens. You just talk back. I learned that talking back meant asking questions. Why can't Mom go back to work? Why can't I keep Dad's old hammer? Why does the flag have to stay up all night? I stopped asking eventually. The house itself changed. Rick painted over the blue walls my father and I had chosen. He tore down the swing from the porch, said it was unsafe. Even the smell changed from cedar and soap to polish and sweat. Mom's dresses got duller, her laughter quieter. Sometimes at night, I'd hear the clink of his belt on the doorknob and the low murmur of her voice apologizing for something I didn't understand. I would pull the blanket over my head and count the way Dad taught me when thunder scared me. Counting was supposed to make storms shorter. It didn't work with this kind. When I was 10, I started spending time in the garage. The space smelled like oil and sawdust, the one corner Rick didn't bother with. My father's old toolbox sat on a shelf, a little rusted but still there. I'd open it slowly, the hinges creaking like they remembered me. Inside were nails bolts, a small hammer that fit perfectly in my hand. I would build things from scraps, a birdhouse, a small box, anything that felt like control. One afternoon, Rick found me there. He picked up the crooked birdhouse and smirked. "Looks like it won't last one storm. Maybe that's fitting." He dropped it, the sound of wood splitting echoing through the garage. I didn't say a word. I just waited until he left, then picked up the pieces. Glue, sandpaper, patience. The next day, it stood again, stronger than before. By 13, I'd learned to stay invisible. Mom focused on Evan's soccer games and parent-teacher nights. Rick bragged about him constantly. Our pride, he'd call him. My pride and joy. About me, he said Clara's the emotional one. She takes things too seriously. He liked saying that word emotional like it was an insult. High school gave me escape for a while. Art club design classes teachers who noticed when I was quiet too long. Mrs. Hendricks, my art teacher, once told me, "You see structure in everything, don't you?" It's a gift. I smiled but didn't tell her the truth. Seeing structure meant I saw where things cracked. At 16, I applied for a design camp scholarship. When the acceptance letter arrived, Rick opened it before I got home. He waited until dinner to say, "They think you're special, huh?" I told them you can't go. Too far, too dangerous, too expensive. I said, "It's paid for." He slapped me before I could finish. The sound was sharp and small, like the snap of a ruler. Mom froze. Evan stared at his plate. After that, I stopped mentioning anything I wanted, but I kept building. I built models late at night, quiet as possible, every wall measured precisely, every roof sturdy. Each one was a promise that someday I'd build something no one could knock down. At 17, I applied to Chicago's architecture program in secret. I used the library computer sent the application and hid the receipt under my mattress. The acceptance letter came months later addressed to me. I came home early from school and found the envelope torn open on the counter. Rick stood by the sink holding it. He smiled without warmth. "So you've been busy. You think you can just run off and leave your family?" He walked closer, the smell of whiskey clinging to him. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" I didn't answer. He ripped the letter in half and let the pieces fall to the floor. Then he said, "You'll thank me one day for keeping you grounded." That night, I went to the garage again. I found the hammer still heavy, still real. I held it in my hand and thought about the sound of wood meeting nail, about how creation starts with impact. I whispered to the empty room, "I'll build a way out." I didn't know how yet. I just knew it had to happen. From that moment, every sketch, every line on paper became part of that plan. By graduation, I had a portfolio hidden under my bed filled with designs of homes with strong foundations and wide windows. Homes where people didn't yell, where doors didn't slam. Sometimes when Rick came home late and shouted about the bills or dinner, I'd imagine living inside one of those blueprints. Safe, silent, solid. Years later, sitting in that hospital bed, those memories would come back like blueprints of everything I'd lost. The house of two fathers, one who built and one who broke. One who taught me to hold a hammer, and one who taught me why I'd need it. They discharged me from the hospital 2 days later with a bottle of painkillers, a bandage around my head, and a warning not to overthink. The nurse smiled kindly, told me to rest, and handed me a card for counseling. I slipped it into my jacket pocket without looking. The taxi ride home felt longer than it was. The sky hung low and gray, the kind that made everything look washed out. When the driver pulled into our street, I almost told him to keep going. But he stopped in front of the house, the one with the trimmed lawn and the flagpole Rick polished every Saturday. The house looked exactly the same, and somehow that was worse than if it had changed. The door opened before I reached it. My mother stood there, hair-brushed apron tied neatly. Her eyes darted from the bandage on my head to the suitcase in my hand. "Oh, sweetheart, you're home." She stepped forward to hug me, but I stayed still. The smell of lemon cleaner hit me. Everything inside gleamed. Even the wall behind the dining table had been patched and painted over a perfect square of new paint covering the memory. The chair that hit me was gone. A different one stood in its place, polished and steady like nothing had ever happened. Rick appeared in the hallway, his shirt tucked in, voice calm and measured. "Look who's back," he said, like a host greeting a guest. "You're tough, kid. Didn't mean to scare you that night. You know how these things get out of hand." My mother looked at him quickly, then back at me. I could see her silently begging me to let it go. I said nothing. He smiled wider, satisfied. "Dinner's in an hour. We'll celebrate your recovery." He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hall. I followed Mom into the kitchen. She busied herself stirring soup. The air smelled of onions and something burnt. I wanted to scream. Instead, I sat at the table. Mom glanced at me and whispered, "Let's try to move forward, okay?" She said it gently, like she was comforting a child after a nightmare. But it wasn't a nightmare, it happened. The patch of fresh paint behind her glared at me. Later during dinner, the atmosphere felt staged. Rick poured himself another drink, but kept his tone friendly. Evan cracked jokes about school, about a girl he liked, and everyone laughed. Everyone but me. Every time Rick looked my way, I felt the same pulse of fear crawling up my neck. I couldn't taste the food. My mother refilled Rick's glass and said, "Evan's coach says he might get a scholarship next year." "Isn't that wonderful?" Rick smiled, pride swelling. "Our pride and joy," he said, reaching to pat Evan's shoulder. Then his eyes shifted to me. "How about you, Clara? You gonna stick to your art projects or maybe get a real job now?" I pushed the food around my plate. Architecture isn't art. It's structure, I said quietly. He grinned. Same thing. Building castles in your head. Mom laughed nervously. Rick, please. He raised his glass. I'm just teasing. Don't be so sensitive, kiddo. I looked at my mother. She avoided my eyes. After dinner, I went to my old room. Everything was still in its place, but dustier, smaller. The bookshelf held my childhood drawings faded by time. I sat on the bed and stared at the wall until the light outside dimmed. That's when I heard Mom's voice in the hallway. Don't upset him again, she whispered. Her tone was pleading. I closed my eyes. She was talking to Evan. Silence followed, then the sound of a door closing softly. I wanted to believe she was trying to protect me, but it sounded too much like surrender. That night, I couldn't sleep. I could hear Rick's footsteps through the floorboards, slow, heavy. Once he stopped outside my door. I held my breath until he moved away. I stared at the ceiling, counting the cracks. 1, 2, 3. Just like when I was a child. The next morning, the sun spilled through the curtains too bright. I went to the kitchen. Mom was already making breakfast, humming softly. She looked up. You should eat something. It's good to have you back. I sat down. Rick was reading the newspaper glasses on his nose. Morning, he said without looking up. Evan joined cheerful talking about his upcoming game. Mom said, Evan, you're our pride. You'll make us all so happy. Then she turned to me, her voice soft. Clara, maybe you could help your brother with his essays. You're good with words, aren't you? Too emotional, Rick muttered behind the paper. I froze. Mom didn't react. My chest tightened, but I smiled faintly. Sure, I said. I'll help. After breakfast, I went outside to breathe. The air was cold, the grass damp. I looked at the side of the house where the old swing used to hang. Rick had replaced it with a row of trimmed shrubs, perfectly aligned, lifeless. I took out a small notebook from my jacket pocket, the same one I'd brought from the hospital. On the first page, I wrote the date. Then I began to write what I remembered, the chair, the sound, the reflection, the silence. Every word felt like a nail holding something steady. The wind blew, flipping a page. I wrote again. Silence has witnesses. It wasn't poetry. It was evidence. Inside, I could hear my mother's laughter again, forced and thin. I looked at the window where I once saw the chair flying toward me. Now it only showed my reflection, older, tired, but awake. The patched wall, the new chair, the quiet, none of it fooled me. They wanted to erase what happened, but I wasn't a patch in their wall. I was the crack they couldn't paint over. That night, I locked my door and hid the notebook under the mattress. The house creaked like it was holding its breath. Somewhere down the hall, Rick laughed at the television. My mother's voice followed, soft and obedient. I pulled the blanket over my head and whispered to myself, this time I'll remember everything. The letter came on a Thursday morning, tucked between a stack of bills and a grocery flyer. The envelope was white and thin with the university seal stamped in blue. I knew what it was before I opened it. My hands shook anyway. I read the words 3 times just to believe them. Full scholarship, Chicago School of Architecture, tuition covered, room and board included. My heart thudded so hard I could hear it in my ears. For the first time in years, the future looked like something that belonged to me. I folded the letter and slipped it into my pocket before Rick came downstairs. He always hated mail that wasn't his. At breakfast, Mom was humming Flipping Pancakes. Evan scrolled through his phone. Rick sat at the head of the table, newspaper open, the smell of coffee strong in the air. I poured myself some juice, waiting for the right moment. When I finally spoke, my voice came out smaller than I wanted. I got accepted to Chicago. Full scholarship. Rick didn't look up right away. He turned a page. Chicago's dangerous, he said flatly. Too many people, too much crime. You don't need to go there. I swallowed. It's fully paid for. I can start this fall. He folded the paper slowly, like it was part of his performance. Family comes first, he said. You owe your mother stability. You owe us respect. I stared at him. Respect or permission? He slammed his hand on the table, making the silverware jump. Don't talk to me like that. You think you can just walk out and start your own life? I didn't answer. Mom placed her hand on his arm. Rick, please, let her talk. He pulled away. She's not going anywhere. Evan looked between us uneasy. I stood up, heart hammering. Then I said quietly, I'll go. I don't need your approval. His face twisted. He stood too, his shadow spilling over me. You'll regret that. Mark my words. I didn't wait for more. I walked out my steps shaking but steady enough. Upstairs, I locked my door and sat on the bed. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone. I'd been saving for months from my part-time design projects online, just small commissions. I could afford the bus ticket to Chicago. That night, when everyone was asleep, I set the phone camera on the mantel in the living room, angled toward the table. I told myself it was for protection, though part of me knew I wanted proof. I waited until morning. Rick was already irritated about something pacing the kitchen, muttering about bills. When he saw me come in, he sneered. You're still here. Thought you'd be gone already. I didn't answer. He moved closer, eyes hard. Don't ignore me, girl. I said, I'm not letting you throw away your life. I took a step back, but he followed. Mom came in from the laundry room, startled. Rick, stop. Not again. He turned, his voice rising. Again. What do you mean, again? She flinched. I looked toward the mantel, knowing the camera was recording its little red light, barely visible behind the vase. Rick's voice grew louder. You think you're so smart, don't you? Always scribbling, always judging. You're nothing without this family. He grabbed my sketchbook off the table, the one with my designs, my models, everything I'd built over years. He flipped through it roughly. These stupid pictures aren't going to build you a life. Then he tore one page, then another, until the sound of ripping paper filled the room. I lunged forward, shouting, Stop it! He shoved me hard. My back hit the wall, pain shooting through my ribs. Mom screamed. Evan appeared in the doorway, frozen again, the same way he was on my birthday. The smell of burnt toast lingered in the air, thick and sour. I looked at Rick's face, red, trembling veins showing on his neck. I saw the man who believed control was love. I also saw fear in his eyes, fear of losing the one person who no longer obeyed him. I straightened up slowly. You can destroy every page I said, but you can't unbuild what I've learned. He blinked, confused. I turned and walked out heart-pounding, leaving him holding the torn paper like a fool. Outside, the air was sharp and cold. My hands shook as I reached for my phone in my pocket. The camera had captured everything. I checked the footage, watched the scene play out again. The shove, the tears, the silence. I uploaded the file to my email and sent it to myself with the subject line, in case I disappear. Then I packed. I didn't take much, just clothes, a small box of tools from Dad's old kit, my laptop and the broken sketchbook. Mom knocked once on the door as I zipped the bag. Please don't go like this, she whispered. I looked at her. You didn't stop him. Her eyes filled with tears. I can't, Clara. You know what he's like. I softened then because despite everything, she was still my mother, trapped, small, terrified. I touched her shoulder. I'll be okay. I promise. She nodded once and stepped back. As I left, Evan stood at the bottom of the stairs. He didn't say anything, just stared. The bus station was half empty. The ticket clerk didn't ask questions. I sat near the window, clutching the bag on my lap. The sun was setting, turning the highway orange. My reflection stared back at me in the glass eyes, red lips still swollen. For the first time, I didn't look like a victim. I looked like someone who was leaving. The bus rumbled to life. The town slid away behind me, slow and shrinking. My phone buzzed once Mom's text, "Be safe. I love you." No message from Rick, none from Evan. I turned the phone off. Through the glass, I saw the fields pass by, endless and quiet. The reflection in the window blurred into streaks of light. I whispered to myself just loud enough to hear, "This is the first step, the first move." I didn't know where I'd sleep that night or what Chicago would hold, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I wasn't going back. Chicago looked nothing like the pictures I had seen in brochures. The skyline wasn't just glass and promise, it was noise steel and survival. The bus rolled into the terminal at dusk, and the cold hit me like a slap. The wind smelled of smoke and wet pavement. I pulled my thin jacket tighter and stepped out, clutching my bag. My scholarship covered tuition and housing, but my dorm wouldn't open until the semester officially began, so I found a cheap attic room above a cafe near Wabash Avenue. The owner, a kind widow named Mrs. Patel, handed me the keys and said, "Pay when you can eat when you must." Her kindness was small but felt enormous. The room was barely bigger than my old closet, the ceiling low enough that I could touch it, but it had a window that overlooked the city. I stood there that night, watching headlights drift below like glowing veins of motion. The next morning, I walked to the university to finalize my papers. The campus buildings towered like modern temples of ambition, all sharp edges and glass. I loved it instantly. When I entered the architecture hall, the smell of graphite and paper filled the air. Students worked quietly at drafting tables, their pencils scratching like rain. I took a deep breath. For once, silence didn't mean fear, it meant focus. The first few months were brutal. I worked part-time at the cafe below my room, serving coffee to strangers before rushing to class. My hands smelled like espresso and glue from model kits. Money was always short sleep, even shorter. But every night I reminded myself that this was freedom, and freedom always demanded its price. One afternoon, while working late in the studio, a soft voice interrupted my concentration. "You've been here since morning, haven't you?" A woman stood beside my table, her silver hair pulled back neatly, her glasses balanced low on her nose. I recognized her Professor Hargrove, a retired architect who occasionally visited as a guest mentor. I nodded, suddenly self-conscious of the smudges on my hands. She studied my model, a small house with open beams and wide windows. "Interesting," she said. "Why the exposed structure?" I hesitated, then answered, "Because hiding the frame doesn't make it stronger." She looked at me for a long moment, then smiled. "That's not just architecture, that's philosophy. Keep that." From that day on, she began checking on me, sometimes bringing leftover sandwiches from faculty meetings, sometimes sitting beside me while I worked. She talked about her years designing affordable housing projects, about buildings that stood firm because they were built for real lives, not magazine covers. She said, "Buildings and people both need a foundation and courage." The line stayed with me. It was the first time in years that an adult spoke to me without condescension or control. As weeks turned into months, I started to rebuild more than models. I began therapy, encouraged by a counselor at the student center who noticed the scars on my wrist when I reached for my ID. I told her I wasn't hurt anymore, but she looked at me with eyes that knew better. "Healing," she said, "isn't the same as pretending." Slowly, piece by piece, I began to learn what stability meant when you built it for yourself. I joined a domestic violence support group on campus, though I rarely spoke. I just listened to women who had left husbands, to students who escaped parents, to a retired teacher who carried an old photograph of the bruise on her arm. Their stories became part of mine, woven into the quiet strength I was collecting. I worked harder than ever, designing through the night, my pencil tracing lines that felt like lifelines. Every time I drew a frame or foundation, I thought of my father's words, "Build it in your mind." First, then make it real. My models became more personal structures shaped by memory. I created one called Resilience, a house split down the center but held together by steel bridges, each joint visible. When I presented it to Professor Hargrove, she stood silent for a moment, then said, "You're not just designing homes, you're documenting survival." I didn't know how to respond, so I just smiled. The following year, she offered me a paid internship at her small restoration firm. I spent my weekends helping restore old churches and broken community centers, learning how to make damaged things whole again. On my first day there, she handed me a stack of blueprints covered in water stains and said, "Every scar tells you what failed last time. Pay attention to that." I did. Every nail, every crack, every uneven joint became a language I understood. Outside work, life remained modest but stable. My attic apartment was cold in winter, so I learned to tape plastic over the windows. I saved every spare dollar in a tin box labeled Future. I still called Mom occasionally, though our conversations were short. She always sounded tired, distracted. Rick's name hovered unspoken between us. Evan never picked up when I called. I stopped trying. One night, after submitting my midterm portfolio, I walked along Lake Michigan. The air was sharp, filled with fog. The skyline glittered like glass teeth against the water. For the first time, I realized that I wasn't afraid of reflections anymore. I reached into my bag and pulled out the old hammer I had kept from my father's toolbox. It was small and worn the handle smooth from years of use. I smiled, gripping it tightly. It wasn't a weapon. It was memory. 4 years passed like a long exhale. Graduation came faster than I expected. I stood in line in my cap and gown, the weight of my degree folder in hand. Mrs. Hargrove hugged me afterward, tears bright in her eyes. "You've built something solid, Clara," she said. "Not just on paper, in life." I thanked her, unable to speak. That evening alone in my apartment, I placed my diploma beside the model of resilience. The city hummed outside, cars moving like veins of light. I sat by the window and thought about everything it took to reach this moment. The nights I went hungry, the mornings I woke from nightmares, the constant noise of memory that never fully faded. Freedom wasn't quiet. It was work, daily, deliberate. And I was still building it. I didn't know then that the past would call me back sooner than I wanted. For now, I let the city hold me, its heartbeat matching mine, steady and alive. The call came on a gray afternoon, just after a rainstorm had cleared. I was at the restoration site tracing measurements on an old church beam when my phone buzzed. The number was familiar, though I hadn't seen it in years. When I answered, my mother's voice trembled through the static. "Clara, it's me. Don't panic, but I had a small stroke last week. I'm home now." Her words fell softly, but the weight behind them pressed deep. She sounded older, slower, fragile in a way I'd never imagined. I asked if she was alone. She hesitated. "Rick's still here," she said quickly. "He's taking care of things." My hand froze midair. The pencil dropped from between my fingers. I wanted to hang up to protect the peace I had built, but guilt is a stubborn thing. I told her I'd visit that weekend. The drive back to Illinois felt longer than it used to. The highways that once led to escape now pulled me back toward memory. The town looked smaller, quieter, as if time had folded it in half. When I turned onto our street, the house stood there unchanged, its white siding bright against the dull sky. The flag still waved on the porch. I parked across the street and sat for a moment watching the curtains flutter. Part of me wanted to turn the key and drive away. Instead, I stepped out. My shoes sank slightly into the damp ground. My mother answered the door before I could knock. She looked frail, thinner than I remembered, her hair streaked with gray. When she saw me, her eyes filled with tears. "Clara, you came." She hugged me tightly, and for a moment I felt the warmth I used to chase as a child. But then I saw him. Rick stood in the doorway behind her, arms crossed, older now, but no less imposing. The lines on his face were deeper, his hair thinner, but the smirk was the same. "Well, if it isn't our architect," he said. "Come to inspect the old foundation." I stepped past him without replying. The house smelled of disinfectant and old carpet. The furniture hadn't changed. Even the patched wall behind the dining table still held its perfect square of paint, hiding what couldn't be erased. Mom led me to the living room. Rick followed, hovering in the background. She sat carefully on the couch, her movements slow. I brought her a cup of tea from the kitchen, and she smiled faintly. "You always were the thoughtful one," she said. I noticed her hands trembling slightly as she lifted the cup. "How have you been?" I asked. She sighed. "Tired. The doctors say I need rest, less stress." "Rick's been trying to help." At the mention of his name, he grinned. "Someone's got to keep things running right." I ignored him. Instead, I looked around the room and noticed a faint layer of dust over everything except his chair. Some things never changed. That evening, I cooked dinner while Mom rested. The sound of oil sizzling felt familiar, almost comforting. Rick came into the kitchen while I was washing dishes. "You've done well for yourself," he said, leaning against the counter. "City girl, big job. Guess I taught you something after all." I didn't look up. "You taught me exactly what not to be." He laughed low and sharp. "Still got that mouth on you." I turned then, meeting his eyes. "And you still think control is love?" He raised an eyebrow. "Careful now. Mom's fragile. She doesn't need more drama." He walked away, the air behind him thick with tension. Later, I sat beside my mother in her room. She reached for my hand. "I'm glad you came. It means a lot." I looked at her tired eyes and saw both love and guilt in them. "Mom, you don't have to stay here," I said softly. "You could move closer to me." She shook her head. "This is my home. Your father built it." I wanted to tell her that the man who honored that house was gone long before Rick arrived, but I stayed silent. That night, after she fell asleep, I walked through the house alone. The walls seemed to whisper. The air carried the faint scent of varnish and whiskey. I opened the garage door and found the old toolbox sitting on a shelf covered in dust. I brushed it clean and opened it. The hammer lay there, the handle worn smooth by years of use. I held it for a long time, the memory of my father's hands guiding mine flashing back in fragments. Behind me, the door creaked. Rick stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "Can't sleep?" he asked. I didn't turn around. "Just looking at what still works," I said. He stepped closer, his shoes clicking against the concrete. "You think you're better now, don't you? Out there in your fancy city pretending you're free." I turned slowly. "No," I said, "just free enough not to pretend." He stared at me for a long moment, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. Then he laughed quietly. "You're still the same little girl always building walls." I held his gaze. "Maybe. But at least mine keep people safe." He shook his head, muttering something under his breath as he walked away. When the sound of his footsteps faded, I exhaled. The night felt heavy but not suffocating like before. I placed the hammer back in the box and closed the lid. Tomorrow, I told myself I would start fixing what could still be saved, beginning with my mother. I turned off the garage light and walked back inside. The house was quiet except for the slow ticking of the clock. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of its sound. The morning started calm, the kind of silence that pretends to be peace. My mother was sitting by the window reading the paper, her glasses slipping down her nose. The air smelled like weak coffee and dust. I was in the kitchen making oatmeal when I heard Rick's footsteps behind me. They were slower now but carried the same weight they always had. He poured himself coffee and said without looking at me, "You've been here a week. Planning to stay forever?" I didn't answer. He smirked. "Figures. People like you always come crawling back when the world doesn't want them." I turned my voice steady. "I didn't crawl." I walked in. He laughed under his breath and walked away muttering something about respect. I carried the tray to Mom. She smiled faintly. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," I said. She sipped the coffee, her hand trembling slightly. "He's been better lately," she said after a moment, as if she needed to convince herself. I looked at her, wondering what version of better she believed in. That evening, we had dinner together. Evan came by for the first time in months. He looked older, tired eyes sunken from long hours at his job. He hugged Mom and nodded politely to me. The table was set, the food warm, the air thick, with unspoken things. Rick poured wine, raising his glass. "To family," he said. No one answered at first, then Mom lifted her glass hesitantly. Evan followed. I didn't. The meal began with small talk, Evan's work, the weather, Mom's recovery. For a while it almost felt normal until she said it. "I saw Clara's article online," she said softly. "The one about rebuilding historical homes. I'm proud of you, sweetheart." The fork froze in Rick's hand. He looked up slowly, his smile tightening. "Proud, huh?" He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Funny I don't remember her building anything here. I don't remember her lifting a damn finger to fix this house." Mom's eyes darted toward him. "Rick, please not tonight." But he wasn't finished. "You're proud of her. She ran off, left you to handle everything. While she was out there drawing lines, I was here keeping this place standing." His voice grew louder with each word. Evan put down his fork. "Dad," Rick snapped, "don't call me that when she's around." He pointed at me. "You see what she's done? She divides this family every time she shows up." I stood slowly. "I divide nothing, Rick. You do that on your own." He slammed his fist on the table. "You don't get to talk to me that way in my house." "My house?" I laughed softly, the sound trembling. "You mean the house my father built?" He froze. The air turned sharp. Mom's breath caught. Rick's voice dropped low. "Don't bring him up. That man left you nothing but pity." I felt something in me break. I looked at the wall where my father's photo still hung, a small frame surrounded by dust. Before I could move, Rick stood up, grabbed the photo, and hurled it to the floor. The glass shattered, scattering across the carpet like pieces of light. The sound split the room. Mom screamed his name. Evan stood up, reaching for him, but froze halfway. The world slowed. I stared at the broken frame. For a second, I wasn't 24. I was 8 again, watching him paint over my blue walls, erase my father's scent, replace it with his own. The reflection of the flying chair flashed across my mind like lightning. The same heat, the same helplessness, the same silence. But this time, I didn't stay silent. I took a step forward, my voice calm and low. I won't watch this twice. Rick's eyes flicked toward me. What did you say? I repeated slower. I won't watch this twice. His jaw tightened. Don't test me, girl. I took another step close enough to see the lines around his mouth. You already did your worst. I survived it. You can't hurt me again. He opened his mouth, then stopped. Maybe it was my tone, maybe it was the way I didn't flinch anymore. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in his eyes. He muttered something, turned, and walked out of the room. The front door slammed hard enough to rattle the windows. The silence that followed was heavier than any shouting could have been. Mom stood trembling, tears streaking her face. Evan bent down, picking up the broken pieces of glass. One cut his finger. He winced, but kept going. I knelt beside him, helping gather the fragments. Be careful, I said quietly. He looked at me, guilt in his eyes. I should have stopped him years ago. I shook my head. We all should have. When the floor was clean, I picked up the photo itself. The paper had torn slightly at the edges, but my father's face still smiled through. I wiped off the dust and set it gently on the mantel. The clock ticked loudly in the corner, each second sharp as a nail. Mom whispered, I'm sorry, Clara. I really am. I touched her arm. Don't say sorry to me. Say it to yourself. I went upstairs, my heart pounding but steady. In my old room, I opened my bag and took out the small camera I had carried for years. I placed it on the dresser facing the hallway. I wasn't scared anymore, but I was done trusting silence. Downstairs, I could hear my mother crying softly, Evan's voice comforting her. The sound wasn't peace, but it was something close to truth. I sat on the bed staring at the faint reflection in the window. The night outside was quiet, the moon pale over the rooftops. I whispered to the glass. He broke the frame, not the memory. Then I turned off the light. The next morning, the air felt different. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Rick hadn't come home after storming out. My mother looked small at the breakfast table, her hands trembling as she buttered toast she didn't eat. Evan sat beside her, silent eyes red. I poured myself coffee, the bitter smell filling the air. No one spoke for several minutes. Finally, I said, I'm going to the police. My mother froze. Clara, please. Don't stir this up again. You don't know what he's capable of. I set the cup down gently. I do know, Mom. That's why I'm going. She looked down, her voice breaking. He'll ruin us. He'll ruin himself. I sighed. He already did. Evan exhaled slowly, then said, She's right. Mom looked between us, helpless. I turned and walked out the door before she could say another word. The drive to the police station was short, but every second felt like crossing a bridge I could never go back over. When I arrived, the same gray building stood where it always had. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly and the air smelled of coffee and paperwork. At the front desk, a woman looked up. Can I help you? I handed her a small flash drive. I'd like to reopen a case, I said. Domestic assault 4 years ago. My name's Clara Jensen. She nodded, typing something into her computer, then gestured for me to wait. An officer came out, a different one this time, older, with tired eyes and a kind expression. Miss Jensen, come with me. In a small office lined with file cabinets, I told my story again. My voice didn't shake this time. I explained everything, the birthday, the hospital, the cover-up, the footage, the years of silence. When I finished, he nodded slowly. Do you have evidence? I slid the flash drive across the table. It's all there. He plugged it in. The screen showed Rick's face distorted by anger, his shove my fall, my mother's cry in the background. The officer's jaw tightened. "You've been carrying this a long time, haven't you?" I nodded. He closed the laptop. "We'll file it properly this time. You'll need legal representation." "Do you have a lawyer?" "Not yet," I said. He handed me a card for a nonprofit legal aid group that handled domestic cases. "Tell them I sent you. They'll take care of you." When I stepped outside, the cold hit hard. My hands shook as I called the number. A calm voice answered. "We'll set up a consultation tomorrow morning, Ms. Jensen. Bring everything you have." The next day, I met with a woman named Angela from the nonprofit. Her office was small, cluttered with folders and coffee cups. She had a sharp, kind face and a voice that carried authority. "You did the right thing, Clara," she said after watching the footage. "You're not just helping yourself, you're preventing him from hurting someone else. We'll build your case carefully, quietly." Over the next few weeks, things moved faster than I expected. The police reopened the file, the hospital confirmed the old record of head trauma, and the report from that night reappeared, marked incomplete. Angela filed motions, drafted statements, and walked me through each step. She explained how the law treated domestic assault differently when evidence surfaced later, how time didn't erase accountability. She said justice doesn't expire even when people try to paint over it. I thought about that patched wall back home and smiled bitterly. Meanwhile, Rick learned what was happening. He showed up one afternoon at my mother's house yelling on the porch. My mother called me in tears. "He says you're lying that you doctored the video." I told her to lock the door and call the police if he came back. I could hear his voice in the background shouting, "You think you can destroy me?" I hung up and drove straight to her. By the time I arrived, he was gone, but the fear lingered like smoke. My mother clung to me, sobbing. "What have I done?" I held her tightly. "You're finally doing something right." 2 months later, the court date arrived. I walked into the small county courthouse with Angela beside me. The walls smelled faintly of polish and history. The courtroom was modest wooden benches, a single flag, and a judge who looked like he'd seen everything twice. On one side sat Rick wearing a gray suit and false humility. His lawyer, a smooth man with an expensive tie, smiled politely as if it were all routine. My mother sat behind me, hands clasped tight, Evan beside her. When the judge entered, everyone rose. The proceedings began. Rick's lawyer spoke first, his voice calm and rehearsed. "Your Honor, my client is a respected member of this community. The alleged incident occurred years ago during a family disagreement. No charges were filed at the time. This recent accusation stems from miscommunication, not malice." He turned slightly, gesturing toward Rick. "Mr. Tanner regrets any distress caused and wishes to resolve this privately." The judge nodded, then looked at Angela. "Ms. Roberts." She stood unbothered by his tone. "Your Honor, this is not miscommunication. This is documented abuse." She handed the judge a file. "Hospital reports, the reopened police record, the time-stamped video." She paused, then looked directly at Rick. "You can patch a wall, Your Honor, but you can't patch over violence." The courtroom fell silent. Rick's lawyer objected, but the judge waved it off. "Proceed, Ms. Roberts." We played the video. The room filled with the echo of that night, the crash, the scream, the silence. My stomach twisted as I watched, but I kept my eyes open. When it ended, the judge leaned back slowly, expression unreadable. Rick's lawyer cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we don't deny that tempers flared, but my client maintains that Miss Jensen provoked him, that the judge, cut him off." "Provocation does not justify violence, Mr. Lang." The sentence hung in the air like thunder. Rick's face tightened, his jaw locked. Angela placed her hand on my arm under the table, steadying me. The judge turned toward me. "Miss Jensen, do you wish to make a statement?" I stood. My knees shook, but my voice didn't. I said, "He broke more than bones. He broke trust, but I rebuilt. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because silence builds monsters." The judge nodded. After reviewing the evidence, he spoke firmly. "There is no justification for what occurred. This court finds Mr. Tanner guilty of misdemeanor assault, sentencing 1-year probation, mandatory counseling, and a permanent restraining order." The gavel struck once, sharp and final. The sound echoed through my chest like release. Rick's face went pale. His lawyer whispered urgently, but he didn't respond. He stared straight ahead, eyes glassy, trapped in his own silence. My mother cried softly. Evan reached for her hand. Angela smiled faintly. "You did it," she whispered. Outside, the air felt lighter, as if the world itself had exhaled. My mother came up behind me, hesitant. "Clara, I don't know how to thank you." I looked at her gently. "You don't need to thank me, Mom. Just live honest." We stood there for a moment, the courthouse steps beneath us, sunlight spilling through gray clouds. Rick walked past, escorted by an officer. Our eyes met briefly. For the first time, I felt nothing. No fear, no hate, just distance. The past had finally stopped chasing me. After the verdict, the days slowed down in a way that felt almost unreal. The noise of the courtroom faded into quiet mornings filled with coffee phone calls and paperwork. My mother's voice on the other end of the line sounded small, almost childlike. She said she couldn't stay in that house anymore, not after the way the neighbors whispered and Rick's friends stopped coming by. I told her I'd help her find a new place, and 2 weeks later I drove back to Maple Valley with boxes in the back seat and a rental agreement for a small apartment near the river. She opened the door before I even knocked, her face pale and drawn, but softer than I remembered. There were no flowers in her hair, no apron, no act. Just my mother, tired and human. Inside, the house felt hollow. The furniture was gone, the air thick with dust and memory. We didn't talk much as we packed. The silence between us wasn't sharp anymore, just fragile. When we finished, she stood in the doorway and stared at the empty living room. He took everything she said quietly. I shook my head. Not everything. That afternoon, I moved her into the new apartment. It was small, just 2 rooms with sunlight pouring through wide windows, but it smelled clean, fresh paint, new beginnings. She sat on the couch looking lost. I made tea the same way she used to for me and handed her a cup. She smiled faintly. "You're taking care of me now." I sat beside her. "Maybe we can start taking care of each other." She nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. I wanted peace so badly, she whispered, "I let violence speak instead." I didn't say anything. Her words were enough. Later that evening, as the city lights came on, she reached for my hand. "I'm sorry, Clara, for not protecting you, for choosing quiet when I should have screamed." I squeezed her hand gently. "We can rebuild Mom, but we start with truth." She nodded again, her shoulders shaking as she cried into her hands. I let her. Sometimes rebuilding meant letting the old walls fall completely. Evan came by 2 days later carrying a box of groceries and guilt. He looked at me, then at Mom. His voice was rough. "I'm sorry for staying silent. I didn't know how to stand up to him." I stared at him for a long time, then said softly, "Silence builds walls too." He nodded, unable to meet my eyes. We spent the afternoon setting up furniture, hanging curtains, fixing things that didn't quite fit. When he left, he hugged Mom tightly and whispered, "You're safe now." I watched from the doorway, realizing for the first time that safety was something you built, not something you waited for. That night, Mom and I ate dinner on the balcony, a simple meal. Nothing fancy. The river below reflected the lights from passing cars. She looked at me and said, "You know your father used to say light always finds its way through cracks." I smiled. He wasn't wrong. Before bed, I helped her hang a photo on the wall. It wasn't of Rick or even of me. It was an old picture of the 3 of us, her, my father, and me, standing in front of the unfinished house he built decades ago. We were smiling, covered in sawdust. I had forgotten how free she once looked. When the frame was secure, she stepped back and said, "Maybe now it's my turn to start over." I kissed her cheek. It's never too late. As I drove back to Chicago the next morning, the sun rose over the fields, pale and new. The road stretched ahead, clear and endless. For years, I had carried anger like a second skin, thinking it was strength. But now, as the wind moved through the open window, I felt something lighter, an understanding that healing isn't a destination. It's a series of small choices, quiet ones repeated until they build something steady. My phone buzzed once with a text from Mom. "Thank you for not giving up on me." I smiled, typing back, "You taught me to keep standing." When I reached the city, I parked by the river, rolled down the windows, and sat there listening to the hum of life around me. Somewhere behind all the noise, there was peace. Small, fragile, but real. The gallery smelled like fresh paint and possibility. I stood in the middle of the main hall, surrounded by beams of soft light streaming through tall windows. My exhibit opened in an hour, and the air buzzed with quiet anticipation. I ran my hand over the title plaque mounted beside the entrance. Structures That Survive by Clara Jensen. The words looked unreal, as if they belonged to someone else. The models were arranged in a circle, each one a story told through wood, metal, and glass. Some were sleek and modern, others fragile and strange. The centerpiece was a scaled installation of a dining room, a replica of a space that once held violence and silence. I had rebuilt it using glass and steel, every fracture line illuminated from within. When the lights hit it just right, the cracks glowed instead of disappearing. People would stand around it later admiring how it caught the light. They wouldn't know the sound of the chair, the smell of burnt sugar, the echo of quiet that followed. They would only see beauty where once there was pain, and that was enough. Professor Hargrove arrived first. Her silver hair shone under the lights as she walked toward me, her smile wide and proud. "You did it," she said softly. "You turned memory into architecture." I hugged her tightly. "You taught me that survival has a structure too," I said. She laughed, eyes glistening. "I just helped you draw the blueprint. You built the rest." As guests began to filter in the room filled with low murmurs and clinking glasses, I watched strangers study my work, their expressions shifting between curiosity and awe. A journalist approached with a recorder. "Ms. Jensen, could you share what inspired this collection?" I hesitated, then answered honestly. "I used to think buildings were about walls and roofs. Now I know they're about what holds them up when everything breaks." She smiled. "That's beautiful. What do you hope people take away from it?" I looked around the room, the cracked glass, the beams bending but never snapping. "That strength doesn't always look solid," I said. "Sometimes it's transparent." She nodded, jotting it down. A few minutes later, an elderly woman approached me. She had kind eyes and carried a cane decorated with small stickers of flowers. She stood before the centerpiece for a long time before turning to me. "Your work. It's personal, isn't it?" I nodded. She smiled sadly. "My granddaughter went through something similar. She's finally safe now." She paused, her voice trembling. "Seeing this, it makes me believe healing is possible." My throat tightened. "Thank you," I whispered. She patted my hand. "Keep building, dear. We need more of this." When she walked away, I stood still for a moment, letting the words settle inside me. The hum of conversation surrounded me like a steady current. I felt something deep shift, the quiet realization that pain, once named and shaped, could become something strong enough to hold others. Later, when the crowd thinned, Evan walked in. He looked hesitant, his hands buried in his pockets. I hadn't expected him to come. He stopped a few feet away, eyes scanning the models. "I didn't think you'd want to see me," he said. I shrugged. "You came. That's enough." He nodded, his gaze landing on the glass dining room. "Is that our house?" I smiled faintly. "What's left of it." He stepped closer, studying the fractured walls, the glowing cracks. "It's strange," he said softly. "It's broken, but it looks stronger that way." I met his eyes. "So are we." He exhaled, and for the first time in years, his smile reached his eyes. Before he left, he said Mom wanted to come, but she was afraid it would be too emotional. "She told me to tell you she's proud." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Tell her I'm proud too." When the exhibit closed that night, I stayed behind to clean up. The staff turned off the overhead lights, leaving only the glow of the installation. The cracks shimmered like constellations in the dark. I sat on the floor, my back against the wall, and looked up at the sculpture. Each beam, each joint, each transparent plane was built from the same truth that once tore me apart, that what survives isn't what stays unbroken, it's what learns how to carry the cracks with grace. The next morning, an article about the show appeared online. The headline read, "Architect Turns Trauma into Art That Shines Through Its Scars." The comments below were filled with stranger stories, people talking about loss, survival, rebuilding. One message caught my eye. It was from a woman in her 60s who wrote, "Your story saved my granddaughter. I sat there staring at the screen, tears blurring the words. Healing, I realized, didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispered quietly through the things you made, the lives you touched without knowing. I closed the laptop and walked to the window. The city outside was waking up, light spilling over rooftops, buses rumbling down wet streets. My reflection merged with the skyline, part glass, part steel, part sky. I whispered to it, "We survived." The lake looked different in autumn. The air was sharp enough to taste, carrying the smell of pine and wet earth. Leaves floated on the surface like scattered memories. I parked my car by the old dock and stepped out, the gravel crunching under my shoes. In the trunk sat a wooden chair I had built myself, simple, sturdy, shaped from oak reclaimed from one of my restoration projects. I carried it carefully to the edge of the dock, its legs scraping softly against the weathered planks. The sky hung low and gray, the kind of gray that felt honest. I placed the chair down and sat facing the water. The wood was cool beneath my hands, grounding. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing in the stillness. The sound of distant geese echoed across the lake. Somewhere, a boat engine hummed faintly before fading into quiet. I thought about all the rooms I had stood in, the hospital, the courtroom, the studio, and how each one had felt like a different kind of silence. This one, though, was the first that didn't hurt. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small carved piece of wood, worn smooth from years of being hidden away. It was a fragment of the dining chair, the one that had struck me, the one that had broken the illusion of family and built the beginning of truth. I held it between my fingers, the grain still faintly visible, the edge splintered. For a moment, I just stared at it, remembering everything. The smell of the cake burning, the flashing red and blue lights painting the walls, my mother's trembling voice saying it was an accident. That night had ended with pain, but it had also started everything that led me here. I whispered softly, "You don't own me anymore," and dropped the fragment into the water. It hit the surface with a small sound, then sank slowly until the ripples disappeared. I watched until the lake stilled again. The reflection that looked back at me wasn't the frightened girl from that night. It was the woman who had rebuilt her life piece by piece. The wind picked up, slightly rustling the trees. A slant of sunlight broke through the clouds, landing on the water like a blessing. I thought of my mother and the photo on her wall of Evan's quiet apology, of the woman at the gallery whose granddaughter had found hope. Every scar had led here to this moment of quiet proof that healing didn't need witnesses to be real. It only needed time and truth. I took out my sketchbook from the bag and flipped to a blank page. My hands no longer shook when I drew. The pencil glided easily, tracing lines of the dock, the trees, the reflection of the sky. At the bottom of the page, I wrote a single line. He threw the chair, but I rebuilt the seat beneath me. I smiled at the words. They weren't bitter. They were simply true. I closed the book and looked across the lake one last time. The surface shimmered faintly, a mirror of light and movement. I remembered what my father once told me when I was little, sitting beside him while he hammered nails into a new frame. "Buildings don't last forever," he had said. "But the hands that build them, the lessons they carry, that's what stands." I ran my fingers over the armrest of the chair and whispered, "You were right, Dad." The lake breeze caught my words and carried them somewhere I couldn't follow. Behind me, the sun dipped lower, turning the water gold for a few brief minutes. The world seemed to hold its breath. I stood slowly, leaving the chair where it was. It didn't feel like leaving something behind. It felt like setting something free. As I walked back up the path, the sound of my footsteps blended with the rustle of leaves. The dock and the chair grew smaller in the distance, framed by the glowing horizon. The last line of sunlight lingered on the water like an echo. I turned once more, taking in the scene, letting it imprint itself in memory. Peace at last had a shape. It looked like still water, like oak and sunlight, like a life rebuilt, not from revenge, but from choice. I whispered to the air. The silence that night built an echo that never died. It built me. Then I kept walking, the sky deepening above me, the lake behind me turning to glass in the fading light. If you've ever been hurt by someone who said they loved you, you already know that silence can be louder than any scream. You know the way a room feels after something shatters when everyone looks away because it's easier to pretend it didn't happen. I used to think survival meant staying quiet, keeping peace no matter the cost. But silence isn't peace, it's permission. and I gave that permission for far too long. When I finally chose to speak to act to rebuild it, didn't feel heroic. It felt terrifying. I was shaking when I handed that flash drive to the officer. My voice cracked when I told my story in court. Healing didn't come from courage, it came from exhaustion. I was simply too tired of living afraid. But here's the truth, no one tells you justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, built brick by brick, the same way someone once built the walls that tried to contain you. Justice can look like waking up without fear. It can sound like your own breath in the morning when you realize you made it through another night without waiting for the next blow. It can feel like sitting by a lake knowing you no longer owe your pain to anyone. For anyone watching this, especially if you've lived with control violence or the kind of love that asks for obedience, listen closely. You don't have to wait for permission to stand up. You don't have to wait for someone else to see the truth. You don't even need to hate the person who hurt you. You just need to love yourself enough to stop letting them win. Maybe your story doesn't involve a chair or a courtroom or flashing lights. Maybe it's smaller someone who raises their voice, cuts your confidence, or uses love as a weapon. Abuse doesn't always leave bruises. Sometimes it leaves silence, and silence can swallow years if you let it. So start small. Tell someone. Write it down. Record what happened, even if you never show it to anyone. Because one day you'll look back and realize those small acts of truth were the first bricks in your own structure that survives. You'll realize strength doesn't mean being unbroken. It means learning how to rebuild. And I promise you can. I built something out of what almost destroyed me. You can too. Maybe that's why I tell stories like this, to remind someone sitting alone in their car or lying in a quiet house pretending everything's fine, that they're not crazy, not weak, not to blame. The people who hurt you will always try to rewrite the story. So write your own before they do. If you're watching this and you've been through something similar, I want you to do one thing for me. Take a deep breath and tell yourself out loud, I am not what they did to me. Say it again until it starts to sound like truth, because it is. And if you've ever stayed silent while someone else was being hurt, there's still time to do better. Don't turn away. Don't excuse it. Don't call it just family. Call it what it is and stop the cycle where you stand. That's how things change. I used to think revenge would feel satisfying, but the real victory was peace, the kind you build with your own hands, plank by plank, decision by decision. Revenge ends when they fall. Justice begins when you rise. So if you're watching, tell me where you're from in the comments. Tell me if you've ever had to rebuild after someone broke what they should have protected. Tell me what silence cost you and how you finally learned to speak. Because somewhere another person is scrolling through the dark, waiting to know they're not alone. And your words might be the reason they take their first step out. Justice starts small with truth, with courage, with you.